All right. Thank you for attending today. I'm going to be talking about HIPAA, research and clinical care. My name is Mike Pera. I'm the CCTS Regulatory Program Director, and I'm an infectious disease physician here, and I did clinical trials of HIV agents starting as soon as those drugs were available. So with that, let's move on and talk about what HIPAA is. Okay, before I just say what HIPAA is, let's just kind of talk a little bit about privacy. I mean, there are laws like HIPAA about privacy, but there's also ethical issues about releasing information that really is not the business of other people, and keeping what you know about people private is part of the medical profession. And that's important in terms of our medical center. If there's a information breach, a patient data breach in the medical center, the whole medical center loses face, loses public trust, and people won't want to come here if they think information about their private health issues is being leaked out. So there are a lot of reasons to maintain patient privacy. All right, on to HIPAA. HIPAA is not a female hippopotamus, but rather the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. When this was written back in 1996, I remember this, is written primarily to prevent insurance companies from denying insurance because of pre-existing conditions. And I do remember my patients with AIDS did not want to literally be seen by physicians because it would enter their charts and they would have a pre-existing condition, and they therefore literally could not leave their job without losing the risk, without the risk of losing their insurance. So it's important for that way, the insurance portability. But the second part of it is the HIPAA privacy rule, which establishes a set of safeguards on the use and release of certain types of health information, which is called protected health information. In a lot of my slides, release of information under the HIPAA language is disclosure. It's called disclosure. The second part of that HIPAA part is the security rule, and that governs the way in which PHI is collected and stored. So there's a lot of IT information there on where it goes and how safely it has to be maintained. And then because it's a law, violations of either of these rules can lead to federal and state penalties. And if you work at OSU, you can lose your job because of it. So what is included in this protected health information? It's these 18 identifiers. And when you go, most of them have something that really tags you, like your name or your street address. But it also includes dates, all dates, except for year, then phone numbers and email addresses and social security, medical records number, et cetera, your account numbers, anything that if that number went out with your health information, people would know who we're talking about. They could identify you. And so it's really identifiers and health information combined. And so that's what's considered protected when the health information is combined with an identifier. So there's 18 of these. So what are the basics? First of all, PHI use. We really should only be using PHI when needed to perform our job, whether our job is a clinician or a provider or a researcher. We don't need more information than what we need to do our job. So we should be using the minimum PHI necessary. When are we allowed to release PHI? When is the medical people holding the medical record allowed to release it? Well, for hospital work, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, and that includes things like quality studies. So treatment is pretty obvious, payment is pretty obvious, and then the operations is quality studies that you really have to, if you're going to provide care for somebody, you have to have access to their PHI. And that's why, as clinicians, you have access to pretty much everybody's PHI in the hospital, because you could be consulted at any time or see anybody in the hospital at any time to take care of them. Excuse me. It's also allowed if the patient authorizes or signs a consent, and HIPAA language uses the word authorizes, to release the PHI to others, that you sign a waiver when you come into the hospital saying that others, people providing care have access to your record. Or in a research study, you sign that the researchers have access to my medical records. The other one that more specifically relates to research is when the IRB approves a waiver of the consent, the authorization. And that means the IRB allows you to look at somebody's record for research purposes. And so that has to be a committee that approves it, and we'll talk a lot about that. And then finally, personal health information gets released if there's an epidemic or certain types of diseases that are reportable by state law. So certain STDs are reportable. COVID now is reportable. Other conditions are reportable, and we have to release that PHI. PHI also, for the interest of this audience, covers any research that uses or creates care-related PHI. So if you're doing a clinical trial of a new drug that is part of the clinical care of that individual, that is PHI, and that has to be covered and treated like PHI. On the other hand, if you're just drawing blood for a research test that that doesn't relate to care at all, then that is not PHI. That is not covered by HIPAA. We'll talk more about some of these things in a few minutes. So how do we get health data for research? So there's two ways. One, the patient, as I mentioned earlier, signs an authorization, or again, it would be considered a HIPAA consent. The saying that I give you my information. And two, as I pointed out a minute ago, there's a waiver. The IRB approves a waiver. They're divided into full and partial waivers that we'll discuss momentarily, of the need for a signed consent from the patient. Now, one can also get PHI or health information that's de-identified. Once you take away those 18 identifiers, this health record, the full details of the health record minus those identifiers, is not considered PHI. So you can do all the research you want on de-identified information without even getting the patient consent or an IRB waiver, as long as it's de-identified. There's a couple caveats about that. One, you're not allowed to look at a bunch of charts and then kind of extract the data and then throw away the PHI, throw away the names and medical record numbers, and because that's not allowed. Somebody known as typically an honest broker does that for you. So the honest broker goes in, gets the medical records, gets rid of all the PHI, and gives you the information as a de-identified data set. Now there's something a little in between called the limited data set. Again, we'll talk more about each of these. It is like a de-identified data set, but you may remember under PHI was all dates and zip codes, and as well as a code. On a limited data set, you can collect pretty much a de-identified data set, except it has dates, can have dates. And it can be coded. Now, why would you want it coded? Well, you want to study everybody with X disease, and you say, give me a limited data set. Well, they'll have dates in there, which is useful, and maybe zip codes. But you ask them to, the honest broker, to code it. That means that the next day when you're looking at it, you go, nuts. I didn't get serum creatinine. I'm going to have to do this all over again, but I'm going to ask for serum creatinine. If it's a limited data set, the honest broker has the code. They can very quickly go in and extract out the serum creatinines on those individuals without having to do the whole search all over again. Now, a limited data set is not full PHI, but because it has dates, it is distinguished from a de-identified data set. And the limited data set doesn't require IRB approval or a patient authorization, but you have to sign a data use agreement with the information warehouse, or the people holding the information. And I'll come back to these points in a minute. Okay, so when the patient, now we're going to talk about PHI with patient authorization. A patient authorization describes the use of PHI and any privacy risk. This is what the patient is signing. The specific elements, to whom you're releasing it, how you're releasing it, and why you're releasing it. So a patient signs this authorization. In WIRB approved studies, the HIPAA authorization is integrated with the consent. In OSU studies, it can be integrated with the consent, but it also can be, and it was in the past all the time, separated from this consent. So the person actually signs a research consent to do the trial and a HIPAA authorization. Now, so now sometimes if it's joint, if it's integrated, then they just sign one form that's the authorization and the study approval. But it can be separate if need be. And I just want to show you what one of these authorizations, this is the OSU authorization here, and I'm just going to quickly flip through it. It goes through a lot of detail, but here's what people are signing off on. Health information about you that will be used or shared with others involved in this study may include your research record, any healthcare records, x-rays, medical records, laboratory results. That patients are giving you access to their full medical record when they sign this. And because it may involve a clinical trial with clinical care, they're going to put that in your record, and it may be a permanent part of your medical record because the research is part of care, clinical care. And so it may become part of, and so they need to know that. When you fill one of these out, and actually whether it's combined or separate like this, you do have to say who you're giving the data to and why. And then finally, something that you should know is that you will not be able to see or copy your study-related information until the study is complete. So if somebody's in a blinded study and you're writing in the notes that they're in arm B or they're in the treatment arm or the standard of care arm, you might put that in your note, but the patient isn't allowed to get that information when they sign this authorization. Okay, so that was when the patient signs. What about when the patient doesn't sign? There is the full waiver and the partial waiver. The full waiver requires the IRB or privacy board to grant this full waiver, and they review your study. We'll talk about what are the criteria. A partial waiver is different. A partial waiver means you're allowed to look at PHI, but only for recruitment. So you can look at a bunch of charts to see who's eligible, but when you're done with those charts because you're going to want to talk to them. You think they're eligible, you're going to want to talk to them, you want to get a consent, an authorization usually after a partial waiver. Now, as I said before, a limited data set is considered minimal PHI, but it does not require a signed patient authorization. And then obviously people who have died, you can't get their consent. And so the you can get this information. You don't go to the IRB for this because the human subjects guidance doesn't require consent of family members to study people who have died. But you can get a form from the medical information management that you fill out about if you want to do research specifically on people who have died. So I should point out that this waiver where the patient doesn't sign that you can have my information does not apply to FDA regulated research. In FDA regulated research, the patient does have to sign that you have access to their records. So if you have questions about that, you should talk to the ORRP, but to some extent it makes sense in that the FDA wants to be sure the patient knows that people are experimenting on them and that it wasn't just an IRB that said it was okay. So let's talk now about the waivers. The IRB waivers, okay, that partial and full waiver require that the study involve PHI of individuals where contact is unknown, or you're going to study 1,000 people, you're going to get records from 1,000 people, and it would be impractical to do this if consent were required. That what you're doing is looking at records and there's really minimal risk to the patient privacy. And then you have to describe the plan to protect identifiers. That is, you're going to keep them in an encrypted file and, you know, or in a locked file in a locked room if it was paper. And then you have to explain how the PHI will not be used or reused. And so those are for waivers. And as I said, a full waiver is what you use if you want to study a full observational trial, where you want to look at all the charts and you want to keep going back to them and collect the data. The partial waiver, on the other hand, is if you're doing a clinical trial with a drug, say, and you're just recruiting subjects and you just need to look in the charts for eligibility. Okay, but both partial and full waivers have to be approved by the IRB. Okay, and I mentioned the limited data set. Again, this is considered to have some PHI in it because it has dates, but it's de-identified. And again, the IRB and Privacy Board approval is not needed, but you need to talk to the information warehouse where you're getting the information or the honest broker and sign a data use agreement where you explain how you're going to use the data, how you're going to store the data, and why you need the data. But that's you know, a detailed medical information. Personally, if I'm doing a retrospective study, rather, because I always forget, well, I should have looked at, I would do a limited data set rather than just fully de-identified, unless I was really certain. All right, what's the honest broker? The honest broker provides the de-identified or coded coding of the PHI. So as I said earlier, you're not allowed to de-identify or code the data for your studies. The IW provides, who is an honest broker, can code it, give the information to you. If you need more, you go back to the honest broker. They won't disclose the code that would identify the patient, but they can go back and using the coded data set and extract more information. Now there's a caveat here that some investigators, rather than get consent, they want to study a group of patients. So they'll get the data as a coded data set. And then a year later, they'll ask for the same data set. Well, what they're doing is, if they know they're going to do that one year, that they're going to want it in the next year, they should be getting consent from patients. But instead, they get a coded data set, which doesn't require consent and doesn't even require an IRB, and they just ask for it a year later. So they've collected a year's worth of prospective data without ever approval, and that's not right. So a coded data set cannot be used repeatedly to collect future data, if that makes sense. And again, this is not, because it's not a signed consent from patients, it's not FDA approved for FDA studies. Okay, so let's talk about how you might do this. You want to do a retrospective chart review. So do you need IRB approval? Do you need a HIPAA waiver? Do you need PHI? Will you need to re-expand or re-examine or expand the initial database? Well, so PHI, are you going to need any of those? You know, if you're not needing personal identifiers, and really a lot of research really shouldn't need you don't need to know that so-and-so has these diseases unless you're going to contact them, and you're usually not. So a lot of personal identifiers, but the ones that catch people are the dates. So typically, to get around the dates, you ask for intervals. Okay, do you need IRB approval? And the answer is maybe. I don't know, for a retrospective chart review. Do you need to review PHI? If you need to review PHI, then you're going to have to ask for a full HIPAA waiver from the IRB, because you want to actually look at a lot of data. Might you later need to expand the initial data? You don't need PHI. So now you can do a de-identified data set. But if you need to review or expand the initial search, then you want coded. You want a limited data set. If you just want, 3,000 records, you don't need them identified, then you just ask the IW or the Honest Broker Operations Committee for de-identified data. Doesn't need IRB review, doesn't need a data use agreement. You're just getting non-PHI. Okay. What if you want to do a clinical trial of a new drug or a new use of a therapeutic agent? Must you get IRB approval or HIPAA authorization to assess feasibility? That is, I want to see if we have enough patients with this disease to do the study here. So you want to count. So the answer is no, not for feasibility estimate of the number of potentially eligible patients. How do you get the numbers? Well, most of you know there's something called slicer dicer and IHIS, and I've used it a little bit. It does take a lot of experience to get it to work right, but it is self-service. You can go in there and you can say, and I've done this, give me all HIV positive people, the ones off drug, the ones who are undetectable viral loads, and I can get a number. I can't get names, but I can get a number. And that's what slicer dice will allow you to do. You have to be careful though, because I mean, that little scenario I just ran, HIV positive, on no meds, undetectable, unless I said alive, and that's a caveat of this, unless I said alive, it would give me people who have died. And so you have to think about exactly who you need and how they're identified. You can ask the IW to perform a de-identified search. That will require a de-identified search, will not require IRB approval. Or I2B2 is similar to slicer dicer, but actually it's developed to do things like I was just describing a slicer dicer, but it's not currently functional is my understanding. And I heard recently about something called Deep 6, which the College of Medicine is buying, which is specifically designed to search for clinical trial eligibility. The Cancer Center is very interested in this. The College of Medicine is interested in this. And this might be the ultimate tool that really is focused on specifically clinical trial eligibility searching of medical records, and it even includes natural language processing. So that's very exciting. So you're going to get a number of patients who are in our medical record meeting the criteria you enter in these devices. And again, no IRB or consents are needed for this. All right. Do you need IRB approval for a HIPAA waiver to see PHI? And the answer is sure. So where will you find the potential volunteers? Are you going to search your own patient charts in clinic? Are you going to search the charts of other eligible patients in my clinic that my colleagues are seeing? Are you going to have your coordinator do this in my clinic and other clinics? Are you going to ask the IW for medical records that meet criteria? Advertise? Are you going to send emails? Which of these do you need IRB approval for a HIPAA waiver? So do you need IRB approval or HIPAA waiver to search your charts? And the answer is no. You could get it, but it really isn't necessary. They're your patients. You have a relationship with them. You've seen their charts. You have a right to be in their charts. So you don't have to do that for your patients. What about the other patients in the clinic that really aren't yours? Well, you should get consent. I mean, like in my clinic, pretty much all of the HIV patients can be cared by any of the clinicians at any time that are in clinic when they have an emergency thing. So by rights, you are ethically allowed to look in those charts. And because you're part of the care team, you're allowed to look in the charts. But if you're not part of the care team, if you're not in the HIV clinic, but in the infectious disease clinic, that's the non-HIV infectious disease clinic, I shouldn't be looking in those charts unless I have, for recruiting patients, unless I have a partial waiver. I hope that makes sense. How about the coordinator? Can I have my coordinator come to my clinic or any other clinic and look for charts? And the answer is no. You have to get if you're just going to use that person to recruit, and again, for a clinical trial, what you're trying to do is recruit into the study, you need to have a partial waiver from the IRB for recruitment purposes. Okay. How about asking the information warehouse for medical record numbers of people who meet the entry criteria? And the answer to that is, in your IRB application, you should specifically say, I'm going to use the information warehouse honest broker to get me identifiable medical record numbers of patients who might be eligible for my study. So you not only have to get a partial waiver, you actually have to describe that in your application, that that's what you want. And if you didn't say you want a partial waiver, they'll tell you need a partial waiver. All right. How about putting advertisements up? Can you do that without IRB approval or a partial waiver? And the answer is, just to put up an advertisement for a study, the IRB has to approve the advertisement. I think you're probably all aware of that. But if somebody reads that and calls you up, are you allowed to look in the chart? And the answer is no, not unless the IRB also granted you, and you have to ask for it, a partial waiver so you can look at the chart of people who responded to the ad. All right. Now a little more complicated one about this clinical trial. What guidelines are there for directly contacting potentially eligible volunteers? Are you allowed to approach somebody in clinic, or your coordinator allowed to approach them in clinic? Are they allowed to call them or email them or or send a letter to those who are eligible. So it's more complicated. The recommendation in the medical center, and most medical centers, is that you don't have a stranger walking up to a coordinator who's a stranger walking up to somebody sitting in diabetes clinic saying, "Hi, I'm Joe Schmo, who's doing a clinical research trial, and I was wondering if you'd like to hear about it and be in my clinic." That's called a cold call, and that's not considered appropriate. That the best thing to do is to have the treating provider or the care team ask the patient if it's okay if somebody discusses a clinical trial with them before the researcher approaches them. That's a problem. That's hard to do. It could be allowed if the provider says, "Oh yeah, in my clinic," the provider of the clinic, "Oh yeah, you can ask my patients about that." The first thing the researcher needs to do in that point is that your Dr. Jones said you might be interested in this study. That the first thing you communicate with the patient is that you're contacting them with the permission of their provider. That's very important. Otherwise, people will know, who the hell are you? How do you know I have diabetes, even though I'm sitting in diabetes clinic or whatever? Similarly, when calls are made, actually, this is where the word cold calls come from, or emails or letters to those who are eligible. Again, you do a screen, you come up with a bunch of names. You do a partial waiver, you come up with a bunch of names of people that you want to ask to enroll in your study. You have to ask a provider if it is okay to contact the patients. Can you call the patient? And again, the provider, if they say yes, the first thing in that communication must be, "Dr. So-and-so said you might be interested in. I'm working with your cardiologist, Dr. So-and-so, or I'm working at least with the cardiology clinic who have suggested you might be interested in this trial." So again, you should put that provider approval in this communication. And when it's like a phone call or an email or a letter that you're going to use to introduce this, you actually have to get that approved by the IRB, because the IRB wants to be sure the communication doesn't overstate what the study is going to do. So any communication with the patient before they sign a consent needs to be approved by the IRB. Okay. And the last thing I want to mention, where do you put research information in the chart? Do you put do you put this clinical trial? Do you put that in a research note? Do you put that in a progress note? I should make the point that research notes, and I don't know if any of you have seen these, but there is in every IHIS chart, there's the potential for there being a research note. A research note actually is separate from the clinical record. So if a lawyer or somebody says, "Send my medical record," the research notes do not go. It is not part of your official medical record. So what do you put in a research note? What do you put in a clinical record? If you're doing a clinical trial and the information you get, like a CBC or a creatinine, is part of the research study, but is also critical for care, then it should be in the routine note. On the other hand, if you are drawing a blood for a serum experimental study that nobody knows the meaning of, or you're just doing a blood draw for research storage, you wouldn't bother putting that. That has nothing to do with their care. So that would go in the research note that you drew the blood for study XYZ week 17 today. So that goes in the research note. All right. And I appreciate your attention. And I just want to point out here that there's a lot more information, very complicated things about using stored biospecimens and what kind of consents, and there's a lot more detail to this than I've just talked about for some investigators. And so I would, you could talk to our regulatory program, Rob Ringel and the CCTS regulatory program. You can call the IRB. They have specific guidances for like biorepositories and what kind of documentation you need for things like that. Then you see database, research databases that contain patient data. There's a couple references there on this helpful patient data sources. And maybe I should point out that if and I see this all the time, if the IRB approves a study, that doesn't mean that you have free rein to run through the charts. I mean, one of my jobs is to allow researchers access to the medical records, and they clearly have to have what everybody else has who has full access to chart: a background check, HIPAA completion, IHIS training, have to be on the research record as key personnel. As clinicians, you have access to all these things, but all of these things you've already done or have already been there, except for the key personnel. So we do limit access to researchers. We give researchers access to the records they need for the research. We don't give researchers access to records that they don't absolutely need to do their research. All right. I thank your attention and have a good day.